Thank you. Okay, so next up is Jupi Dara, fashion as self-expression, but whose self, which actually follows on quite nicely from some of the themes in Suzanne's.
Exactly. I wanted to say first that, well, I write my my speeches because otherwise I start talking and I don't know when to stop. So I
It's like me.
times because I just finished writing it before 6:30. Anyhow, I wanted to say one thing. The beautiful speech, and it's very interesting, this idea of made in France being a political creation, because to some extent even the made in Italy follows the same path, because when Mussolini goes into power, he forbids use of French terms, and Italian fashion is forbidden to look at French fashion essentially. And when the war is over, fashion houses in Paris are closed for a couple of years. Therefore, Italian designers have to invent their own ways because they could not copy Chanel or Balenciaga or the other fashion houses in Paris, because during the early 40s they were closed, and this prompts them to come up with their own designs and their own ideas, and it's very similar. So we can say that in 1952, when the Italian fashion system was born in Florence, it's very similar, albeit with few centuries of after a few centuries, at least partially. Okay, so let me share my there you go. Can you see it?
Yes. Great. Thank you.
Okay, forgive me if I... Okay, 1 second, it's loading. There you go. If I stumble, as I said. Okay, so an increasingly abused platitude about fashion is that it seems to coincide with self-expression. If you want to see this in action, try to ask your students what is fashion, and 9 times out of 10 they will answer with a confident and proud face that fashion is the expression of your own self. In fact, the more one studies the domain of fashion, its meaning in society, and its nature, the less this claim seems to be true. What people are really explaining when invoking self-expression seems to be how they aim to use clothes, rather than the very nature and function of fashion. In the following minutes, I want to problematize this approach by following 3 main paths: the historical framing of fashion and its function, the socio-psychological understanding of the self, and then I'll move to clothes and ask the question, can they accurately communicate such an intimate message? Fashion, as we understand it today, came together in the 19th century. You may not agree with this, there is debate, but if you want I can explain this later on. So to me, fashion came together in the 19th century in Paris, when an English couturier, Charles Frederick Worth, established his business in the French capital and elevated the profession of dressmaker to unprecedented heights. Now, the couturier could tell queens and empresses what to wear. He was not just making the clothes for them, like Rose Bertin was for Marie Antoinette. He was telling them what to wear. With him, fashion shows were also born. For this to happen, however, society had to change, become more fluid, and the place of an individual within the social hierarchy had to be dictated by their success and income rather than by their surname and title. Real fashionistas at the time dwelled in conspicuous consumption, and every woman who aimed to be à la mode, at the time they called them la parisienne during the late 19th century, who aimed to be à la mode according to the fashion magazine of the time, was expected to change her outfit 7 or 8 times per day. In that world dominated by conspicuous fashion consumption, self-expression would have been considered a danger and was expressly sanctioned. Clothes needed to communicate the social ambitions of a woman, her place in the social hierarchy, and her respectability. Uniqueness and creativity would have brought her astray from the traditional path of fashion and the traditional path of society. In fact, this approach to fashion has been intertwined with the business for many decades, and similar use of clothes can be noticed in the more recent Bret Easton Ellis masterpiece American Psycho, where branded clothes are always used to convey the status of the wearers, never their intimacy. Another evidence of this approach in the 1970s is the more humble but no less compelling series Dynasty. The 70s and 80s were also the age of the total look, an idea allegedly brought into mass-produced clothes by the Italian stylista Walter Albini. Total looks say about the brand more than they reveal about the wearer. The reason why I'm not mentioning Saint Laurent and I'm mentioning Walter Albini is because Saint Laurent operated at the time in couture, and Walter Albini never really entered couture. He started with mass-produced clothes. Our contemporary and liberal obsession with identity is partly the effect of the erosion of the hierarchical social order, and this is rather recent and Western feature. Postmodernism, however, as we will see, is a cluster of contradiction. On the one hand, it takes to the extreme the modern concept of individuality. On the one hand, it takes to the extreme the modern concept of individuality, turning it into individualism. On the other, it splinters the self and undermines the very possibility of communicating it to the external world. At this point, we must try to approach the hitherto unaddressed elephant in the room. What is the self, and what is the relationship that the self has with fashion? The self can be described as the sum of the beliefs that an individual holds about their own personality attributes. When approaching the self, however, it appears as a more complex entity. Everyone possesses many dimensions of the self. There is a private, intimate self and a group self, shaped by our position concerning a certain social group and in opposition to other social groups. And then there is an external projection of my own ideal self, and this does not necessarily coincide with who I am. For sociologist Erving Goffman, the presentation of self is always fictional, and for this reason he compares the social negotiation of the self to actors playing on stage. We do present ourselves in society also through clothes, but that is our social self, our position in society, within our social hierarchy, and this communication is not necessarily entirely conscious. Goffman calls it the front stage. This, however, does not have much to do with our personal and private self, which only comes to life when the crowds don't watch, and it's always at risk of popping up and ruining our social performance. Think, for instance, about the fake German heiress Anna Delvey, whose story has recently been told in a fortunate Netflix production, Inventing Anna. I don't know if you if you were lucky enough to watch it. For Goffman, our real self is the so-called backstage. We present an idea of self to others, but behind this facade lives another self. In his pivotal work, Psychology of Clothes, one of my favorite books on the subject, Flugel discusses the contradictory nature of clothes, not only fashion, and points out that even the word that is meant to signify the most intimate of human characteristics, personality, comes from the word persona, which in Latin means mask, namely another item to wear. For Flugel, clothes serve three main purposes: decoration, modesty, and protection. The original and most compelling reasons to get dressed, however, for Flugel are the first two. According to Flugel, the dresses serves two masters at once. On the one hand, decoration, which aims to reveal and to beautify; on the other, modesty, which aims to hide and conceal. The latest can be seen as the very opposite of getting dressed to express oneself. Being typical of religious communities, workplace, or conservative social groups, modesty is the very attempt to diminish the outer appearance of the individuality and bring the individual closer to their peers. As Flugel writes, clothes resemble a perpetual blush upon the surface of humanity. The self, in the case of modesty, is not denied, but becomes a private and secret luxury that does not need to be flaunted. The idea that the self can be consciously expressed through clothes rests upon a naive view of the self, namely that we know who we are. It is, however, at least since Freud, that this idea has become outdated. Psychoanalysis has proposed that the truth about our own desire is to be found in our unconscious, a virtually inaccessible area of our minds. In their daily practice, psychoanalysts do not pay too much attention to the content of their clients' words. They are much more interested in dreams, sleeps, free associations, and symptoms. In other words, the gaps that our conscious life has left unfilled and therefore function as cryptic gates to our unconscious truth. Said very plainly, psychoanalysis has subverted the principle of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and reversed the relationship between think and am. As French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan put it, I think where I am not, therefore I am where I don't think. For them, truth is not to be found in my conscious and uncontrolled expressions, but in whatever escapes the lies and traps set by my conscious and deceitful will. An objection to this may be that psychoanalysis rests upon theory and has limited empirical evidence, but similar doubts have been raised also by social psychologists, and these doubts have been underpinned by solid empirical research. A recent study has demonstrated the discrepancy between Instagram users' online personas and the real individual characteristics. The study revealed a twofold problem. On the one hand, Instagram users were found to have an idea of themselves that was different from the one conveyed in their Instagram accounts. On the other, observers were not, in other words, their followers, were not able to consistently predict personality traits and self-attributes just based on social media accounts. One problem was on the side of the codifier of the message. The other was on its decoding. Similarly, one of the classic studies by Wilson and colleagues, 1982, demonstrated that predicting one's own mood is extremely difficult for people. A group of subjects was asked by the researcher to predict their own moods against several variables, such as weather and the amount of sleep received. The researchers concluded that the reasons why people have difficulties in this type of forecast is that they are often blinded by preconceived ideas. These researchers demonstrated that ideas about the self that we hold do not necessarily coincide with who we are. Moreover, they cement the idea that our self is not to be confused with our social self, the projection of our identity to the outside world. What we are conveying through fashion is not necessarily who we are, but how we would like to be perceived. One of the problems with the self in our society seems to be that it has become a disembodied. This is Anna Delvey, by the way. One of the problems with the self in our society seems to be that it has become a disembodied, discursive, and therefore solipsistic entity. The first element to fall in postmodernity has in fact been the physical nature of the body. The latest and most dangerous social negotiation, is that the second element that has fallen is the social negotiation that is at the very base of our identities. This radicalization of the self and individualism reduces the self to a whim. I am not the product of a social process, but I convince myself that I am what I decide to be every day. I am what I wear. We dream of a shell that coincides with its content. Can fashion still communicate? And this is my last segment. Once problematized the self, it is time to problematize the extent to which fashion can communicate. The contemporary liberal idea that wants fashion as the ultimate vehicle of self-expression contains an embarrassing irony, because it presents the intimate need to express oneself as a luxury, a preserve of the rich who can buy their freedom of expression in fashion stores. In the 21st century, thanks to the fall of ideologies and the fragmentation of the left, capitalism has achieved an unprecedented success to design itself as the enhancer of freedom and liberation. In her book, The Fashion Self, sociologist Finkelstein, provocatively compared the contemporary emphasis on the outer appearance of the physiognomic studies of the 19th century, when Dr. Lombroso and his followers proposed that one's character and criminal inclinations could be predicted by their physical characteristics. In fact, the idea that fashion can convey one's character and values reveals another deep contradiction. Of our society. On the one hand, we discourage people from judging others by their appearance. On the other, we demand to be judged, read and understood based on what we wear and how we use makeup and cosmetic surgery. If consumption is the ultimate sign of one's intimate self-expression, then the repressed in our society become those who are excluded from consumption, from fashion consumption, that is. Consumption is not only a way to convey one's success and taste, or a way to shy away from them, but acquires a mystical and transcendental property, something that goes beyond its modern scope. The ability of clothes to communicate the self has been problematized by several scholars, such as Joan Finkelstein, already mentioned, and fashion theorist Llewellyn Negrin. Fashion collections, and with them our wardrobe, have progressively become more casual over the last decade, and the success of brands such as Off-White and Vetements is a testament to this idea. These brands have not only brought casual clothes on contemporary pret-a-porter catwalk, but they have also blurred the lines between evening and sportswear. If these very innovative and profitable collections, however, look like freedom at its purest, think again. We may have been freed from the constraints on formal and business attire, but, as Negrin suggested, if today people can wear whatever they want, it's because nothing they wear carries a meaning anymore. If anything goes, nothing matters. And it is because any freedom can only operate within the constraints of some limitations. The typical example of this is language. If we can understand each other, it's because we are enslaved by the fact that we have to speak the same language. To put in semiological terms, if the signified today has been eradicated from its signifier, how can any signifier be the carrier of meaning? One and only one meaning seems to be the true prerogative of fashion, and that is fashion itself, being up to date, being cool, being part of an inner group constituted, like any social group, in opposition to another, the unfashionable. And so, in today's world, if we care so much about launching messages, it's not because it is the end, it's only because it's the nth fashion trend. And just like in the past, the fashion pendulum can shift away from this quest for depth at all costs, when the wind of trends will go somewhere else. Effective communication of any sort requires several elements. This is the signifier and the signified that have been detached. Effective communication of any sort requires several elements. One, the subject who speaks, one who listens, and a mutually intelligible code. But in a world in which the individual is not counterbalanced by a common language, communication becomes impossible. If everyone wears anything with absolute freedom, without embracing any code, with meaning understandable to others, they are not communicating to anyone. Styles become reduced to a personal language, a radical idiolect that can only be understood by the wearer. Expressing an idea, let alone yourself, in this situation becomes harder and harder. To conclude, I must say that it is also very important to avoid a moralistic approach to the use of fashion, because if you thought I was being moralistic, I was not. But what to do then? It would probably be the case to reconsider the apology of indifference implied by Gilles Lipovetsky in his account The Empire of Fashion. For Lipovetsky, fashion opens up a new possibility for the democratization of society. In his view, the shallowness in human relations is not only good, but also desirable. He claims that the more progress the ephemeral makes, the more stable democracies become. The fewer people feel about one another, the better they will get along. We are pushed to desire, and we prefer if we are pushed to desire, we prefer the realm of fantasy rather than a universe of confrontation. The frivolousness of fashion, together with its potential to hide and protect one's idea of intimate self, are probably not completely attuned with our postmodern life, and yet they seem to answer well the question of what is the nature of fashion and what its communication potential. Sorry, I stumbled as I said. We need a fashion shower.
There we go. That was fabulous, Juicy. Well done. I mean, you always make me feel incredibly stupid. I want to ask,
I think so.
start the ball rolling. Can fashion be self-fulfilling, do you think? That, you dress and you dress a certain way because of who you are, because of the self, but the self is molded in a sense by the clothing that you wear, that you become what you dress for. they talk about dressing for success, for example, and that, but can it?
Yeah, but that's an ambition.
Mold.
That's an ambition. It's not an expression of who you are. It's an ambition of who you want to become. So my point was not the fashion cannot communicate anything in general, or clothes for that matter, but it's to problematize the communication of one's own self. And in this world, I think that so much effort is being put in the individual, and I don't know if this is necessarily a bad thing, but this undermines the potential of communicating mutually understandable concepts. And fashion does this all the time. I don't know, for instance, I put some clothes by Vetements in which Kvasalia, at the time was Kvasalia, recreated all the outfits, taking as an inspiration the garments of McDonald's workers. So in that sense, the signifier and the signified are detached. And this is happening constantly in fashion. And this is not because they wish to communicate certain things, but it's because fashion requires newness. And newness is to be found in places where that have not been used by fashion before. That's the reason why fashion is so fascinated by the anti-fashions. So the church, punks, whatever anti-fashions that Polemus conceived.
And do you distinguish between fashion and clothing?
Absolutely. Fashion. When I say fashion, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, for me, fashion came together in the 19th century with in Paris. Because before that moment, as Suzanne was saying, there were very heavy sumptuary laws that prevented people from different social classes to wear the same kind of. The trickle-down system could simply not happen because they could not copy each other. It was very important to tell a prostitute apart from a lady. And it is only when society changes, after the French Revolution, men renounce lavish clothes and embrace the masculine renunciation, and ladies remain the site where the husbands show their wealth. It's that the moment in which fashion is born. And fashion requires female literacy because fashion magazines need to be read, and it requires trains to bring in information and fashion magazines and clothes from one place to the other efficiently. So for me, everything that comes before the 19th century, if we call it fashion, is a very loose term. But the way in which we can see fashion today, to me, was born in the 19th century. And when I say fashion, I mean a very specific system of production and consumption of clothes. So this excludes a lot of, for instance, for me, the amazing, beautiful clothes of the Chinese, the
revolution,
No, before the revolution.
Oh, before, I love the communist clothing.
Oh yeah. But that's once again not fashion. The first thing that they did was to avoid the possibility of buying clothes. So if we use them, it's fashion. But the way they use them was not fashion. And the same thing, the imperial clothes were beautiful, but that is not fashion. Fashion requires change, requires structures that to me did not exist before the 90s. It requires essentially capitalism and modernity. That's what it requires.
Ian, your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Jeppy. This is really good. I'm not sure. In fact, I've got probably two questions. Really, that's probably the first thing. Is that I wonder if you've seen the work by Fred Davis.
No.
His claim that he, for example, said, if you see language, and this is taken up by Malcolm Barnard in more recent years, but Fred Davis originally in the early 90s said that clothing and fashion is not a semiotic language. We said if you try to put it at the same level as our way we articulate, fashion will always fall short. So he said, for example, that we should see fashion, we should see clothing as a quasi-code. For example, there won't be the relationship, for example, between the speaker and listener and using a mutually intelligible code in the way that you described it. He said, rather than that, he said, what fashion and what clothing does is open up a conversation rather than close down the conversation. And therefore, it opens it up as a meaningful expression between people. Now, what you said beforehand about the notion of fashion, this goes back to the notion, is the individual wearing something that's fashionable? Are they articulating something which is about self-expression, is what you talk about, or whether in fact they're expressing someone else's expression? In other words, they're expressing the designer. And I think that's a fair point. But you see,
even in that case, the designer is not expressing himself; he's expressing different instances.
Absolutely.
So the idea of self for me is always problematic. But I do agree with you. And in fact, my main answer to my students when they say that, I say, okay, so you're always buying the same clothes, therefore buy Gucci, and the latest collection, not just any clothes. So how does that relate to the idea of individuality? I totally agree on this point. I don't know about, I need to read the points about the previous point that you were making about the being a semi-language, because I actually was referring also, I didn't mention it and I didn't quote in this specific talk, but to Roland Barthes and his idea of language, of fashion as a language. But the point is, how can it open a conversation if we don't have the same understanding of things? And one of the contradictions in this power of communicating that requires everybody to speak the same language in terms of clothes as well is, for instance, the very famous example of when the certain subcultures, which obviously they're not fashion, they're outside of the fashion system by their own choice, but is when they use things like the swastika, for instance. Now, it would be very wrong to think that they are Nazis, because they are not using, they are using it to repel society. They're using what we think is repellent so that we could be repelled by them. But we don't know that, and we mistake it for Nazism. So this is the reason why a conversation to happen, to me, needs to have a mutually intelligible meaning, set of meanings. And in fashion, this is very difficult, extremely difficult. And it's becoming increasingly difficult because all the codes are crumbling now.
But on the other hand, would you agree that the whole nature of the fashion industry is based upon, as you rightly say, about this notion of the shell and how the shell portrays itself? So, for example, I think it would be unlikely that individuals will ever shy away from the notion of trying to portray themselves in a certain way. They will want that. They desire that, because that's the very nature of what we do as individuals because we desire the need to communicate. So what's really interesting is, rather than say that they can't communicate, is actually maybe more interesting to say, how do we communicate through dress? Because we do. So therefore, we've got to be much more aware about how the nature of the communication takes place, and goes back to this notion of Fred Davis. A quasi-code, for example, is not necessarily science specific. It's something which is loose and it opens up rather than closes down. And I think that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my main point was not whether fashion communicates something, because fashion does communicate my position in the social hierarchy, for instance. And as I said, in the 80s, Dynasty expresses this very well, or American Psycho, or the Victorian clothes. Now, the point is, for me, is two things. One, the self is impossible to know, let alone to communicate from a conscious standpoint. And that's the first thing. So every time I put an outfit together, I'm not necessarily conveying my own self, because that is not so straightforward for the reasons I said. And that was my my main point, really. So yeah,
really good. Really,
other things, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. The really interesting presentation.
I would like to publish it in some peer-reviewed journal, but I need to expand it a little bit, and then I aim to publish it. Thank you.
Claire, your hand's up.
Thank you. Wonderful paper, wonderful. So stimulating, exciting, interesting. The point that I'm thinking of is that the other big change that happened along with the French Revolution, the shift in class status and fashion and social status, was of course the big shift in generational significance, so that fashion used to be the people dressing up to look like their superiors in class, in age. Now fashion is very much about youth culture. And I was wondering whether or not there's anything to be learned from the surrealists, who are fascinated not only with sort of Freud, Lacan, but with the idea of play. And play is usually thought of as the opposite of the seriousness of adult moral, high cultural, bourgeois cultural capital. But play is the game, isn't it? So it's different from thinking of fashion as a language to communicate. It's thinking of fashion as a game of interchange and of exchange of identities. And that's another set of readings for your bibliography about Winnicott and play and the
Oh yeah, I love Winnicott. Yeah.
Do you? I love Winnicott too. I think Winnicott would love your work. I think it's wonderful.
We will love each other. Yeah, no, Winnicott is, and Melanie Klein as well, but Winnicott is obviously somebody I...
You're already there. You're already there.
I've got a psychoanalytic background in my first master's. So yeah, I do think that the surrealists, because obviously I'm always very careful. I always did the other paper last time saying that to me fashion is not art, it's its own domain with its own rules, etc. And Schiaparelli, obviously, she is, you know, when Schiaparelli closed her maison, I think her heritage was taken on by so many different designers. And one of them was Franco Moschino. And Franco Moschino did in the 80s a little bit of what Schiaparelli was doing before, but in a very ironic, postmodern, and somehow superficial in the best possible term way, frivolous way. And I think there is a lot of play there. But I must note that fashion has not been playful for a long time. This playfulness of fashion, even Elsa Schiaparelli was not playful. In fact, it was extremely deep. I'm thinking about the skeleton dress, in which this idea of the body that becomes the dress and the bones that become the dress, it's wonderfully explained. And then I think I do agree with you. Since the 1960s, when youth became a marketable category, that this has shifted towards little by little youth and individualism.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, Katie.
Well, I would just say, following on from that, because I love the skeleton dress as well. I mean, it's amazing. But in that period of time, you know, sort of newness would stick around for a lot longer than it does now. And this idea of identity with social media and, you know, it's moments and it's gone and it's something else that's new. And the whole concept of identity and who they're looking at on the screen, you know, every moment of the day, it just kind of, this idea of the self is just changing constantly with kind of new technologies. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are very beautiful studies on social media that explain how some people on social media are much more open to reveal private details as opposed to in real life. And yeah, I also agree about the fact that everything is becoming very quick and very quick, and trends are lasting less. Even the 20 years rule, trends come back after 20 years. It is still true, but sometimes trends now are coming back after 10 years because the rate of obsolescence is reducing of a dress. Yeah, what will remain of this period, I don't know.
I wonder what people creating their own avatars, for example, is going to bring to this conversation as well. Yeah. Leo, your hand's up.
Yes. Hi, everyone. No, I just wanted to add to what Ian said. I think the reference to Fred Davis is very relevant to what Juppie was saying, and I think in some way reflects the essence of Juppie's the approximation of the fashion as a form of communication. I think, Juppie, you will find extremely useful for your paper. And also, Ian, what you were saying, it reminded me, I think it was Wim Wenders that in a film said, what's an identity is an image of ourselves, and what we do is we strive to represent the image, which in fact, and Juppie, that leading. Going back to your point, what self, it's nothing is fixed, nothing is precise. So that level of approximation of the self, but also fashion as a form of communication, as Davis puts it, I think it's very very interesting. Yeah, just wanted to add this.
Yeah, I'll definitely put it in my in the rest of my paper. Thanks.
And aren't we made up of many selves in terms of how we dress for different audiences? I know if I go home to see family, I'm wearing different clothes to what I wear to work or in London, whatever. We'll sort of a bricolage of selves, really.
Well, Juppie also referred to that when this reference to Gottman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have we are different selves in different social situations, but then when you go back home and you're alone, you have the backstage of yourself, and you never wish that to become public. It's something that when you are on a phone call or when you are on a Zoom call and somebody naked passes behind you, that's sort of this friction between public self and private self that should never emerge. We know it's there, but we shouldn't see it.
There are many public and many private selves as well. I mean, the way I behave with my friends is different with my colleagues, and it's different with my family, with my closest friends. So we have many different selves.
Absolutely.